My husband died, leaving behind a 2009 Honda with 180,000 miles on it. That was all I thought he had. For 35 years, I managed every dollar in our home, every bill, every budget, every sacrifice. I called him a dreamer. I called him impractical. I said it to his face, and he just smiled. Turns out, Raymond knew exactly what he was doing. He just never told me. And what he left behind didn't just change my life. It changed everything I thought I knew about the man I married. But when our children found out what was waiting for me, I learned something about love and about people that no one prepares you for. Before we go any further, I just want to say thank you. If you found this channel today, welcome. This is a place for stories that stay with you. Stories about quiet people who did extraordinary things, and the ones they left behind trying to understand it. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from. I mean that. I read every single one. Hit subscribe so it finds you. Now, let me tell you about Raymond. Raymond Morrow was not a practical man. That's the first thing you need to understand about him. He showed up to our very first date 20 minutes late, carrying a vinyl record. Not flowers, not chocolates. A record. He set it on the table between us, like it was the most natural thing in the world, and said, "If you understand why this album matters, I think I'm going to fall in love with you." John Coltrane, a love supreme. I told him I didn't know much about jazz. He leaned back in his chair and smiled like I'd just given him the best possible news. "Good," he said. "That means I get to show you." That was 1987. I was 29 years old, fresh off a promotion at Tulane Medical Center, already building the kind of life I'd promised myself growing up without much. Organized, forward-moving, careful. And Raymond was playing piano 3 nights a week on Frenchman Street, teaching music theory to anyone who'd sit still long enough to listen, spending his weekends at estate sales and storage auctions, carrying home boxes of old records and yellowed papers like they were sacred objects. To everyone else, it looked like clutter. To Raymond, every single piece meant something. I married him anyway. My mother pulled me aside the week before the wedding. She held both my hands and looked at me the way only mothers do, with love and worry, wearing the same face. "Celeste, baby," she said softly, "that man is never going to make you rich." I told her I wasn't marrying him for money. She gave me the look. The one that means I believe you and I don't believe you at the same time. For 35 years, I ran our household like a small, careful business. Every bill, every budget line, every retirement contribution, that was me. Raymond's income arrived the way weather arrives, sometimes generous, sometimes absent, always on its own schedule. Piano gigs, paid when they paid. Teaching at Jefferson Parish public schools, paid modestly, and always a little late. And his collecting habit, that's what I called it. His collecting habit quietly swallowed money in small, consistent amounts, the way a slow leak ruins a foundation. You don't notice it happening, until one day you do. We weren't poor, I made sure of that, but we weren't the comfortable I'd imagined when I was young either. Our daughter Simone grew up watching me at the kitchen table every Sunday morning, checkbook open, pen in hand, making the numbers behave. She absorbed my practicality like a language. She became an interior designer, precise, organized, always 3 steps ahead. Our son Marcus loved music the way his father did. But Marcus became a music industry attorney in Atlanta, because Marcus understood early what his father never seemed to, that loving something and being able to sustain yourself loving it are 2 completely different problems. He learned that lesson watching Raymond. They both loved their father. I want to be clear about that. They just didn't take him seriously, not fully. And if I'm being honest with myself, the kind of honest that grief forces on you, Whether you're ready or not, neither did I. Not the way he deserved. Raymond had a hand injury in 2003. Nerve damage. Right hand. It ended his performing career overnight. He spent about 3 weeks being quiet and still, in a way that was painful to be near. Not dramatic. Raymond was never dramatic. Just absent from himself, in a way I hadn't seen before. And then one morning I came downstairs, and he was sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee. Calm. Settled. That particular look on his face that meant he'd already made a decision without telling me. "I'm going to focus on the collecting," he said. I remember exactly what moved through me in that moment. Not support, not curiosity, just a quiet, familiar exhaustion. I sat across from him and said, very carefully, "Raymond, the collecting doesn't pay anything." He looked at me with those steady eyes of his. "Not yet," he said. That was all. Not yet. I let it go. I always let things go with Raymond eventually, because arguing with a man who is completely unafraid of your disappointment is a specific kind of exhausting that wears you down over time. The years moved the way years do when you're busy, fast in the rear view, slow while you're living them. Raymond drove that deteriorating Honda. I drove a sensible Camry. We took modest vacations. We helped the kids with college as much as we could. We sat on the porch on summer evenings, him playing old records through the screen door, me reviewing reports, neither of us feeling particularly unfulfilled. That's the truth. Our life was genuinely quietly good. Raymond died 3 years after his cancer diagnosis. He managed it with the same calm he brought to everything, telling me, the children, and almost no one else. He spent his last year doing exactly what he'd always done. Estate sales, dealers, long phone calls I wasn't meant to hear, disappearing into that basement study of his, the one with the standing rule that I was never to reorganize it. At his funeral, an elderly man named Chester Williams gripped my hand, white-haired, still, the kind of stillness that comes from decades of listening more than speaking. "Celeste," he said quietly. "Raymond always told me you were the only person he trusted with it. I assumed he meant the house, the finances, the ordinary logistics of widowhood." I nodded and thanked him and moved on down the receiving line. I was wrong about what he meant. I was wrong about a lot of things. But that understanding was still 6 months away. For now, I was just a 5-year-old woman in a black dress, trying to remember how to breathe. I managed. I grieved. I kept moving. The way I'd always kept moving. I thought the hardest part was already behind me, but that piece was about to end. Because Raymond, impractical, unpredictable, completely unafraid of my disappointment, had left me one more thing to reckon with. And this time, there was no budget line for it. No way to make the numbers behave, just a brass key. And an address 12 blocks from home. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. 6 months to the day after Raymond died. It came through his attorney, a quiet man named Gerald Fontenot, whose office was on Carondelet Street, and who had apparently known my husband for 20 years, without ever once appearing in any story Raymond told me about his life. That detail alone should have told me something. Gerald called first, asked if he could stop by, said Raymond had left specific instructions about timing, that nothing was to be delivered before the 6-month mark. He said it with the particular tone of a man who has been sitting on a very large secret for a very long time, and is quietly relieved to finally set it down. He arrived at 10 in the morning. He placed 3 things on my kitchen table: a letter, in Raymond's handwriting, a small brass key, and an envelope containing a single address, Esplanade Avenue, 12 blocks from the house where we'd lived for 30 years. Gerald said Raymond's instructions were specific. Go to the address alone, read the letter before going inside. I looked at that key for a long time. It was ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of key that could open a back door or a storage unit, Nothing about it said, "Your entire life is about to tilt." But my hands weren't steady when I picked it up. "Is this some kind of property?" I asked. Gerald looked at me with the careful expression of a man who has promised to say only what is necessary. "Mrs. Morrow," he said quietly. Raymond left very detailed explanations inside. "I think you should read his letter first." After he left, I sat at that kitchen table for a long time. The letter in front of me, the key beside it. I'm not sure what I was waiting for. Maybe some part of me already understood that whatever Raymond had written was going to shift the ground beneath everything I thought I knew. I opened the envelope. The letter started simply. "My darling Celeste, you were always right that I was impractical. I want you to know I knew you were right. I loved you for it. And I built this anyway." I stopped. "Read those last 4 words again. I built this anyway." 35 years of Sunday morning budget reviews. 35 years of absorbing the quiet gap between what Raymond spent and what I had planned for. 35 years of that particular exhaustion that comes from loving someone whose relationship with money you will never fully understand. And he had known the whole time. He had known exactly what I thought of him. And he had built something anyway. I kept reading. By the time I reached the part about the archive, the collection, the townhouse, the Smithsonian curators, who had apparently been waiting, per Raymond's instructions, for my arrival, I put the letter down, walked to the window, stood there, looking at our street. The oak tree Raymond planted the year Marcus was born. The porch swing he repaired 4 times rather than replace, because he liked the original wood. Our ordinary, beloved, completely ordinary street. And 12 blocks away was a Victorian townhouse on Esplanade Avenue, containing the most important private collection of American jazz history that existed anywhere in the world. Built by my husband, held entirely in my name, for 30 years. I didn't cry. I want to be honest about that. I stood at that window and felt something. I still don't have a clean word for. It wasn't joy, it wasn't grief, it wasn't even surprise exactly. It was the feeling of standing too close to a painting your entire life, seeing only brushstrokes, only texture, only the small, imperfect details, and someone finally stepping you back far enough to see the whole image. And the whole image was magnificent. I drove to Esplanade Avenue that afternoon, alone, as Raymond had instructed. The townhouse was a restored double-gallery Victorian soft yellow paint, black ironwork, the kind of building that makes you slow your car without meaning to. It looked like someone had spent years caring for it, not maintaining it, caring for it. There was a man sitting on the front steps. He stood when he saw me coming, tall, elderly, white-haired, with the particular stillness of someone who has spent decades listening more than speaking. "Mrs. Morrow," he said, "my name is James Turode. I've been working with Raymond for 15 years. He told me you'd come. 15 years. This man had existed in Raymond's life for 15 years, without a single mention at our dinner table. What exactly did he tell you?" I asked. James looked at me with quiet, unhurried eyes. "He said you'd arrive in the afternoon. He said you'd have driven yourself. And he said the first thing you'd ask wouldn't be about the collection." I felt something shift in my chest. What did he say I'd ask? "He said you'd ask why he didn't tell you." I stood on that sidewalk in the afternoon light, looking at this man who knew my husband in ways I apparently didn't, and felt the first real wave of something complicated move through me. Not anger, not quite. Something closer to vertigo. And did he leave an answer? I asked. "To that question." James nodded slowly. "He left several," he said. "Would you like to come inside?" The basement archive was climate-controlled, museum-lit, absolutely silent, in the way that only carefully preserved things are silent. I walked through it for 2 hours without speaking. Coltrane's handwriting in the margins of sheet music, working through the harmonic structure of a love supreme in real time, in his own hand. On paper, Raymond had found in a box in Cincinnati that a dealer sold for $800 because he didn't know what he had. An unreleased recording of Miles Davis. A private session that preceded Kind of Blue, capturing the exact moment the concept of that album began to breathe. Personal letters between Duke Ellington and Billy Strayhorn, spanning 20 years. Tender and unguarded in the way people are. Only when they believe no one is watching. Over 3,000 individual items, every one of them documented, every one of them legally acquired, every one of them preserved to museum standard, by a man who drove a 2009 Honda with 180,000 miles on it, so that no one would look too closely at what he was actually doing. And then, in the corner of the last room, I stopped. Thelonious Monk's piano, the one he played in his apartment on West 63rd Street. I put my hand on the top of it and stood there without moving. Raymond had touched this piano. Raymond, who I called impractical, who I managed and budgeted around and quietly, lovingly condescended to, for 35 years had been the secret guardian of American music's most sacred objects. While I balanced the checkbook, I stood there with my hand on Monk's piano, and something in me went very, very still, not broken, not overwhelmed, just rearranged, like furniture that had always been in the wrong place, finally moved. But that wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part came later that night, back at our house, when I opened Raymond's journals and found the entry from March 1999. The recording came through. A private collector in Amsterdam who needed money and didn't understand what he was releasing. I used the emergency fund. Celeste doesn't know. I'll replace it before she notices. This tape cannot go to Europe. I read it twice. Then I set the journal down on the kitchen table and looked at the wall for a long time. He had used our emergency fund and replaced it quietly before I could find the gap. A man making a unilateral decision about shared resources because he believed correctly, as it turned out, that what he was protecting was worth it. And because he knew also correctly that I would have said no. What do you do with that? What do you do when the person you loved was right and secretive at the exact same time? I didn't have an answer that night. I just sat in that kitchen with his handwriting in front of me and the brass key on the counter. And 35 years of Sunday mornings, suddenly looking completely different. In the dark. That's when I knew I would not stay silent. Not about what he'd done, not about what I'd missed, not about who Raymond Morrow actually was. Some silences protect you, and some silences are just the sound of something waiting to finally be understood. I didn't tell the children right away. I needed 3 days with it first. Just me, and James, and the archive. Every morning I drove those 12 blocks to the townhouse on Esplanade, made coffee in Raymond's kitchen. A kitchen I had never seen before, decorated in a way I never would have chosen. Warmer than our house, more colour, more texture. Old records on open shelving like books on a library wall. I'd stand there in the morning light with my cup, looking at the choices he'd made in a space I never knew existed, and feel something I couldn't name yet. Not grief, exactly. Something quieter than that. Something like meeting a person you thought you already knew. Raymond had kept journals, 30 years of them, organized chronologically on a shelf in the archive's anteroom, in the same small, neat handwriting he used for everything: grocery lists, birthday cards, the notes he left on my pillow when he got home late from gigs. I started reading from the beginning. January 1994. Found a collection of correspondence from a dealer in Cincinnati who didn't know what he had. Paid $800 for a box of letters. 3 of them are from Strayhorn to Ellington. I sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes before I could drive home. I put the journal down, picked it back up, kept reading. September 1999. Spent the afternoon with the Coltrane manuscripts again. Every time I look at his handwriting in the margins, I think about how close this came to disappearing. One estate sale in the wrong direction. One dealer who didn't care. Gone forever. That can't happen on my watch. On my watch, Raymond, who I had watched drive that deteriorating Honda for 15 years, because I assumed he simply didn't prioritize practical things. On his watch, I closed the journal and walked to the window. Outside, the Marini was doing what it always does in the late morning. Slowly, warmly, without apology. A woman hanging laundry on a second-floor balcony. Two men gesturing at each other across a fence about something that clearly wasn't serious. The specific quality of October light that only exists in New Orleans golden, and a little heavy, like it knows something you don't. Raymond had chosen this neighborhood deliberately. I understood that now. The Marigny, where jazz was lived, not just performed. He had wanted me to be here. He had always been thinking about where I would eventually land. At night, back at our house, I moved through the rooms differently, slower. I stopped managing surfaces and started looking at them. His record collection along the living room wall, the records I had always considered decorative clutter, background texture, in a home I maintained with careful precision, I started pulling them out one by one, reading the liner notes. Sitting with them the way you sit with something, when you finally stop being too busy to pay attention. On the fourth night, I put on A Love Supreme, the record he had carried to our first date. I sat in Raymond's chair, and I listened. Not as background, not as atmosphere. I actually listened. I don't have the musical vocabulary to describe what happened to me in those 45 minutes. I just know that by the end of it, I understood at a level below language why Raymond had spent his life the way he spent it. And I understood why he had trusted me with all of it, because he had always known I was capable of this, of finally sitting still long enough to hear what he'd been trying to show me since our very first date. Simone called on the fourth day. I'd missed 2 of her messages. For Simone, that constitutes a minor emergency. "Mum, are you okay? You seem distracted." "I'm fine, baby. I'm working through some things." "What kind of things?" I looked at the brass key on my kitchen counter. "Your father left some instructions I'm following," I said. A pause. "What kind of instructions?" "The kind that take some time to understand." Another pause. Longer. "Mom." Her voice shifted. "Into that particular register she uses, when she has decided, quietly and with love, that her mother needs managing. Should I come home?" I heard it differently than I ever had before. That specific tenderness, with the assumption folded inside it, that I required supervision. I'd heard that tone for years without fully recognizing what it contained. "Not yet," I said. "I'll call you when I'm ready." I hung up and sat very still. The grief I'd been carefully managing for 6 months had quietly rearranged itself into something else. Not anger, not sadness, something more like clarity, the slow, irreversible kind, the kind that doesn't make noise when it arrives. I went back to the journals that evening. I read for 3 hours, and then I found the entry I hadn't been expecting. April 2018. Rose mentioned feeling unappreciated again after the university passed her over for department chair. She has no idea. She thinks this is her whole life, the budget, the management, the holding everything together. She doesn't know yet that she's been holding something much larger than she realizes. I hope, when she finally sees it, she forgives me for the waiting. I set the journal on my knee, looked at the ceiling. She thinks this is her whole life. He had written that in 2018, 6 years ago. While I was sitting in our kitchen running the numbers, He was 12 blocks away, writing about me in a journal, in a house I didn't know existed, worried about whether I would forgive him. Something moved through my chest that I didn't try to name. I just let it move. The next morning, Chester Williams came by the townhouse. He arrived with a brown bag and the easy comfort of a man who had sat in that kitchen many times before. We ate, and he talked about Raymond stories I had never heard, told sideways and unhurried, the way old musicians tell everything. He used to say, Chester told me, folding his foil wrapper carefully with weathered hands, that the music was always fighting to stay alive. That every generation there were people who let it die, not out of malice, just out of not paying attention. And then there were people who kept it breathing. Raymond decided, a long time ago, which kind of person he was going to be. I thought about that. Did he ever doubt it? I asked. All those years of people not taking him seriously, did he ever wonder if he was wrong? Chester looked at me with the gentle directness of a man who has survived grief more than once. Mrs. Morrow, he said, Raymond never doubted the work. The only thing he ever doubted was whether he'd done enough to make sure you'd be okay when you found it. I nodded slowly, looked down at my coffee cup. Outside, a trumpet was playing somewhere 2 streets over, unhurried, unaccompanied. Just the sound of someone practicing in the middle of an ordinary morning, because the music required it. Raymond would have stopped whatever he was doing to listen. I stopped too, just for a moment, just long enough. If you're still with me right now, thank you. Because what I'm about to tell you about what happened when my children walked through that door took me a long time to be ready to say out loud. I began to think, very carefully, about what Raymond had understood, about what I had spent 35 years almost seeing, and about what kind of woman I was going to be for whatever years I had left. I called my children on the 8th day, not the 4th, not the 6th, the 8th, because I needed every one of those days first, reading Raymond's journals, sitting with James in the archive, listening to Chester talk about my husband the way people talk, about someone they genuinely understood. I needed to know who Raymond was before I could explain him to anyone else. Simone arrived first. She walked into the Esplanade townhouse, and I watched her designer's eye move through every room. The way it always moves quick, assessing, cataloguing value before emotion has a chance to settle. She was quiet through the main floor, quiet through the archive entrance. She stood in front of Coltrane's handwritten lead sheets for a long time. Long enough that I thought something was shifting in her. Long enough that I felt something like hope. And then she turned to me. Mum, do you have any idea what the licensing rights on those unreleased recordings are worth? Not Dad did this. Not. I never knew he was capable of something like this. Not even. How are you doing with all of this? Just the money. I kept my face still, filed it away, said nothing. Marcus arrived the next morning. He was more careful than his sister. He had always been more careful, more aware of how things landed on people. He hugged me longer than usual at the door. He walked through the archive slowly, with what looked, genuinely, like reverence. He paused at Monk's piano, put his hand on it briefly, and I thought, there he is. There's Raymond's son. But by dinner, the attorney had taken over from the son. He started asking questions. Trust structure, tax status, board governance, licensing agreements for the audio collection. Professionally sound questions, every one of them. Questions about assets, not about their father, not about me. I sat across from my children at Raymond's dining table, a table he had chosen, in a house he had built for me, surrounded by 30 years of proof that he had been paying a completely different kind of attention than any of us had given him credit for. And I listened. The way I used to listen in hospital board meetings, not reacting, just receiving information, noting the gaps between what was being said and what was actually being meant. Who was performing concern? Who was feeling it? The gap between those two things was wider than I had prepared myself for. That night, after the children had gone to their rooms, I called Gerald Fontenot. I didn't even finish explaining what I'd observed before he spoke. Raymond left additional instructions, Gerald said. He anticipated this, Celeste. He was very specific. I felt something settle in my chest. What exactly did he anticipate? I asked. He anticipated that when your children discovered the scope of the estate, their love for you and their interest in the assets might become difficult to separate. The line was quiet for a moment. He knew his own children, I said. He loved his own children, Gerald said gently. There's a difference. I stood at the kitchen window after I hung up. The Marigny at midnight is never fully silent. Music finds you even then slipping through closed windows, drifting up from somewhere a few streets over. Raymond had known that when he chose this neighborhood. He had known everything about what this place would feel like, before I had ever set foot in it. 2 days later, Gerald delivered the additional documents. The trust structure was airtight, sole trustee authority residing entirely with me. Every decision about the collection, its access, its governance, its future mine alone. No loopholes, no shared authority, no grey areas. Raymond had closed every door he didn't want opened, with the same quiet precision he'd used to open the ones he did. He had also left a separate note, short, 4 lines, written on plain paper in his small, neat hand. Celeste, when the time comes, and it will come, remember this: the collection doesn't need managers. It needs a guardian. You already know the difference. You always have. I folded that note and put it in my pocket. I carried it there for the rest of the week. I want to tell you about the moment I fully understood what Raymond had done. Not the archive, not the trust. Not the 3,000 artifacts or the Smithsonian curators, or Monk's piano in the corner of the last room. The moment I understood Raymond was smaller than all of that. It was a journal entry from 2005. Traded in the Accord today, bought the Honda. Celeste thinks I just can't justify a car payment. She's not wrong. But the real reason is simpler. The less impressive the car, the less closely anyone looks at anything else. Let them think I'm impractical. Let them think I'm a dreamer. The work continues either way. I read that entry 3 times. The Honda. That embarrassing, perpetually apologetic 2009 Honda with 180,000 miles on it. He had chosen it deliberately, not because he couldn't afford better, because a better car asked questions he didn't want to answer. He had worn impracticality like a disguise. For 30 years, while 12 blocks away, he was preserving the cultural inheritance of an entire American art form. I sat with that for a long time. Then I went to find James. He was in the archives anteroom, cataloguing a new acquisition correspondence from a private dealer that Raymond had arranged before he died, and which had arrived 2 weeks after. The funeral. He was still completing the work, even from the other side of it. James, I said, in your honest opinion, what did Raymond want for the future of this collection? James set down his pen, thought for a moment in that unhurried way of his. He wanted it to stay alive, he said. He wanted the music to keep breathing. He wanted scholars and musicians and students, especially students from communities that created this music, to have access to things that had been hidden or lost, or quietly sold away from the people who made them. Not a commercial enterprise, I said. James looked at me steadily. Raymond would have rather burned it, he said quietly, than watched it become a commercial enterprise. I nodded. Walked back through the archive slowly on my way out, past the Coltrane manuscripts, past the Miles Davis tapes, past Ellington's letters to Strayhorn, tender and private, and never meant for the world, until Raymond decided the world needed to hold them carefully. I stopped at Monk's piano, put my hand on it again, the way I had on the first day, but it felt different now. The first day I had stood there in shock. Today I stood there in understanding. Raymond had spent 30 years making one quiet, unwavering argument that some things are worth protecting, even when nobody believes you. Especially then, I thought about my children at that dining table, their questions about licensing, their proposals about governance, their genuine love, tangled up with something they hadn't even recognized in themselves yet. I thought about what Raymond had written in 2018. She doesn't know yet that she's been holding something much larger than she realizes. He was right. I had been holding it my whole marriage. I just hadn't known what it was. Now I did. And knowing it changed what I was willing to accept. From my children, from the world, from myself. I went back to the house that evening, and I sat at the kitchen table, and I thought about Raymond choosing that Honda, wearing the disguise, letting everyone look past him, so the work could continue. He had waited 30 years for the right moment. He had never rushed it. He had never forced it. He had simply prepared and trusted that when the time came, the right person would know what to do. The jazzman's last note wasn't written in 30 years of journals. It wasn't preserved in 3,000 artifacts in a climate-controlled archive. It was written in the trust he placed, in one person, who he believed would hear it correctly. I was that person. I had always been that person. I just needed to act like it. The stage was set. All I had to do was wait for the right moment. And Raymond had taught me something important about waiting. Patience isn't weakness. Patience is just preparation that hasn't introduced itself yet. It happened on the third evening, not because I planned it for that night specifically, but because Marcus made it necessary. He arrived at dinner with a document, printed, bound, placed at the center of Raymond's table with the careful confidence of a man who has worked very hard on something and wants you to feel the weight of that work before he asks you to approve it. He called it a preliminary framework. Simone sat beside him, aligned, prepared. The two of them across from me, at their father's table, in their father's house, presenting a plan for their father's life's work that neither of them had known, existed 8 days ago. I let Marcus present it. All of it. Board governance, licensing revenue streams, a family foundation model with both of them in operational roles, a touring exhibition strategy for the artifact collection, a proposed streaming partnership with a major music platform for the unreleased audio recordings. He presented it well. Marcus always presents things well. When he finished, he looked at me with the careful optimism of someone who believes they have been genuinely helpful. Simone folded her hands on the table, waiting. I looked at Marcus, then at Simone, then down at the cover of the bound document. I turned to the first page, read 3 lines, and closed it, quietly, no drama. Just closed it. Marcus, I said, since you arrived, how many times have you asked me how I'm doing? He blinked. Mom, not about the estate, I said. Not about the collection or the trust structure or the tax implications. How many times have you asked how your mother is doing? The dining room was very still. Simone, I said, turning to my daughter, your father spent 30 years doing something extraordinary. In 3 days. Have you asked me a single thing about what it felt like to walk into that archive for the first time? Simone's jaw tightened slightly. The way it does when she is feeling something, she hasn't decided how to express yet. We're trying to help you, Mum, she said. I know you are, I said, and I meant it. That was the part that was complicated. I meant it completely. I knew they were trying to help. I knew they loved me. What I was watching wasn't malice. It was the particular blindness that arrives with grief and shock, and the disorienting discovery that the world contains more than you thought it did. I had felt that blindness myself. Standing in the archive on the first day, hand on Monk's piano, trying to locate myself inside a life I hadn't known was happening. The difference was that my blindness had cleared. I needed theirs to clear too. "I've spoken with Gerald Fontenot," I said. "Your father left a complete legal structure for the archive and this property. It's an irrevocable trust, sole trustee authority residing entirely with me. All decisions about the collection times its access, its governance, its future times are mine." I slid a copy of the trust document across the table, one copy to Marcus, one to Simone. "This isn't negotiable," I said. "And it isn't personal. It's what your father built. It reflects what he understood about how this collection needs to be protected." Marcus read it carefully. The way he reads everything, looking for the seam, the place where the language leaves room for a different interpretation. There wasn't one. Raymond hadn't left a seam. I watched Marcus reach the end of the document, set it down. "Look at the table for a moment." "He didn't trust us," Marcus said quietly. "Not angry, hurt. The real kind." "He trusted me," I said. "That's different, and it's not an indictment of you." "Then what is it?" I thought about Chester at the kitchen table, about James in the archive anteroom, still completing acquisitions Raymond had arranged before he died, about a journal entry from 2005 and a man who chose a deteriorating Honda so no one would look too closely at what he was actually doing. "It's a man," I said, "who spent 30 years watching what sudden wealth does to families, and deciding to protect his family from it, including from themselves." The silence that followed was different from the silence before, less tense, more spacious, like something had been set down that had been carried too long. Simone was looking at her hands. When she looked up, something in her face had shifted. "Did he think we were greedy?" she asked. The question was quiet, genuinely quiet, not defensive. Just a daughter wanting to know what her father thought of her. "No," I said. "He thought you were human. He thought love and money in the same room is one of the hardest things there is. And he thought I was the only person he trusted to hold this without letting it. Hold me." I let that sit for a moment. Then I said the thing I had been preparing, not for 3 days, but for 8. "I'm establishing the Raymond Morrow Archive as an independent charitable trust. The board will include Smithsonian representatives, Howard University's music department, the New Orleans Jazz Museum, and 3 members of Raymond's musical community times, including Chester Williams and James Turode." Marcus looked up. "You're excluding us from governance." "I'm protecting our relationship," I said. "There's a difference." "That's a fine distinction, Mom." I looked at my son. This man Raymond and I had made together, who loved music enough to build a career protecting it legally, who had his father's eyes and his mother's precision, and who was sitting across from me, not yet able to see that what I was doing was the most loving thing available to any of us in that room. "Your father was very good at fine distinctions," I said. "I'm learning from him." I stood up, not in anger, not in triumph, just because I was done sitting. "You're both welcome here," I said, "as my children. Whenever you want, however long you want, this house has room." Raymond made sure of that. I looked at them both. These 2 people we had raised imperfectly and completely, and loved without condition, even when the conditions were hard. "But this archive belongs to the music," I said. "And the music belongs to everyone who needs it. That's what your father decided 30 years ago. In parking lots and storage units and estate sales. And late nights in an archive, 12 blocks from our home. And I am not going to be the person who undoes that." I walked to the window. Outside, the Marigny was doing what it always does at dusk. filling slowly with music from somewhere nearby. That particular New Orleans thing, where the sound finds you before you find the source. A trumpet from one direction, a piano from another, the city breathing in its own language, Raymond's language. Behind me, I heard Marcus set the bound proposal on the edge of the table, quietly, without argument. And then, nothing, just the music coming through the window. And the three of us, sitting inside what Raymond had built, finally still enough to feel it. And in that silence, I finally felt free. Not from my children, not from the grief, not even from 35 years of Sunday mornings, balancing a life I thought I fully understood. Free from the version of myself who had spent a lifetime standing too close to the painting. Raymond had always known the whole image was magnificent. He just waited until I was ready to see it too. I live on Esplanade Avenue now, the yellow Victorian with the black ironwork, and the archive in the basement, and the kitchen Raymond designed with more colour than I ever would have chosen myself. I've stopped missing the choices I would have made. His are better. Every morning I come downstairs before the city fully wakes, make coffee, sit at the table by the window, watch the Marigny come alive in the early light, slow and warm and completely unbothered, the way this neighbourhood has been waking up for 100 years. Some mornings Chester comes. He lets himself in through the side door, the way he apparently always did when Raymond was alive. And we sit with our coffee and don't always talk. And that silence is one of the most comfortable things I have ever known. Some mornings James arrives early to open the archive, before the researchers get there. Graduate students from Howard and Tulane. Musicologists from universities I've never visited. Young musicians from the Ninth Ward, who come quietly and stay for hours, and leave with something in their eyes that I recognize now. The same thing I felt, standing at Monk's piano on the first day. The feeling of suddenly understanding what you've been connected to all along. The Raymond Morrow Archive opened formally 4 months after that evening at the dining table. Small ceremony, no press. Just the board members, the researchers, Chester and James, and my children, both of them. Because they came, and they came correctly. Marcus flew in from Atlanta, without a proposal, without a framework, without a single question about governance or licensing. He stood in the archive for a long time, in front of his father's journals on the anteroom shelf, ran his finger along the spines, without pulling any of them out. Just acknowledging them, I stood beside him and didn't say anything. Neither did he. We didn't need to. Simone redesigned one of the upstairs rooms as a gift. She didn't ask permission. She just arrived one weekend with paint samples and fabric swatches, and spent 3 days making something that looked like what Raymond and I might have chosen together, if we'd ever had. The chance to choose something together, without a budget telling us what we couldn't have. When she finished, she stood in the doorway and looked at it. I stood beside her. "Is it okay?" she asked. "It's him," I said. She turned away quickly, but not before I saw her face. We cried together for the first time since the funeral. Not grief exactly, something past grief. Something that arrives only after you've moved through the hardest part and come out the other side, still holding each other. There is a word I keep returning to when I think about everything Raymond left behind. Not treasure, not archive, not legacy. Faith. He had faith in the music. He had faith in the work. He had faith in the people he chose to share it with. Chester, James, the researchers, the musicians, the community he quietly built, around something he believed deserved to survive. And he had faith in me. 35 years of faith, expressed not in grand declarations, but in journals written at midnight, and estate sales at dawn, and a deliberately unremarkable Honda and an address on Esplanade Avenue held in my name for 30 years, waiting. The jazz man's last note wasn't a sound. It wasn't a recording, or a manuscript, or a letter. It was a brass key on a kitchen table. It was an address 12 blocks from home. It was 30 years of quiet, patient, completely impractical love, saying the only thing Raymond ever really needed to say: I always knew who you were. Now go find out for yourself. Some people spend their whole lives waiting to be seen clearly by someone who loves them. I had that. I just didn't know it until he was gone. And here is what I want to leave you with, the thing I carry now on ordinary mornings at the window, with my coffee and the Marigny waking up outside, and the archive, 1 floor below, breathing quietly in the dark. Raymond was impractical. He was inconsistent and unhurried and quietly stubborn, and he drove that Honda until it had nothing left to give. And he was the most faithful person I have ever known. Faithful to the music, faithful to the work, faithful to me. In the way that matters most, not the way that announces itself, not the way that asks to be noticed, but the way that simply continues, quietly, patiently, without needing you to understand it, until you're finally ready. I was 65 years old before I was ready, and it was not too late. That is the most important thing I know now. It is not too late. Whatever you have been standing too close to, whatever image you have only been seeing in brushstrokes, whatever voice you have been too busy, or too practical, or too tired to sit still and actually hear, it is not too late. Step back, sit down, listen. Raymond taught me that. The jazz man's last note is still playing. And if you're quiet enough, you can hear it too. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Is there someone in your life you've been calling impractical? Someone whose quiet work you've been moving past without stopping to look at it closely? Sit with that today, just for a moment. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, not because of the archive or the money or the trust, but because of Raymond. Because we all know a Raymond, and most of us haven't told them yet what they meant to us. Drop a comment below and tell me who is the person in your life that you've been underestimating. Or just tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one, every word. And if you're not subscribed yet, this is your invitation. Thank you for listening.